how to make cheddar biscuits for one. So first we set our oven to 450 degrees. So I'm going to hit bake. I'm going to hit the plus sign until I get to 450, like that. And then you hit start and it will preheat. And in this case, it will beep once it is truly at 450 degrees. So now when I measure the flour, I scoop it and then I take my butter knife and I take that flat part of my butter knife and I scrape it against the top in order to take off any excess on the top so that you truly have a true measurement of a 1/3 cup of flour. But in this case, we need 2/3 cups of flour, and so therefore I'm going to do it again. So because I need to use this again and I need to place my flour somewhere, I'm putting it in my custard cup, or in this case, my ramekin. Okay. So now I am going to scoop, and right now there's a mound, all right? I don't want that mound, so I'm gonna take my butter knife and I'm going to scrape it. Well, first I'm gonna make sure that the flour is in there, and then I scrape it out as such, and I put my 2nd 1/3 cup in here, and now I have my 2/3 cups of flour. So now I'm going to measure out the baking powder. And so for this recipe, I need a teaspoon and a half. So I'm going to grab my teaspoon and my 1/2 teaspoon, okay? So in order to measure baking powder, if you notice, there is this little ledge here, okay? And what you do is you scoop, and with all dry ingredients, you need to level off the dry ingredients. So I'm gonna use that little ledge there to scrape off the mound on top so that it's perfectly flat, and now that is a true teaspoon of baking powder. So I'm going to put that here in my custard cup, okay? And now I need a 1/2 teaspoon. So now I grab the 1/2 teaspoon and I'm gonna do the same thing. I'm going to scoop. I have a mound, but that's too much. That's not truly a 1/2 teaspoon. So I'm going to scrape it off the edge here. Going to pour it in. And now there is my teaspoon and a 1/2 of baking powder. Now I'm going to do the same with the garlic salt. So I scoop, and then I use the back edge of the knife to scrape off any excess so it's a true measurement, and pour it into my custard cup or ramekin. Now the recipe calls for a large pinch of Old Bay seasoning. And so if a recipe ever says that it calls for a pinch, what a pinch or a dash means is an 1/8 teaspoon. Now standard set of measuring spoons does not come with an 1/8 teaspoon. However, what you would do is grab your 4th teaspoon and you are going to fill it up halfway. You're going to eyeball it halfway, and that would be an 1/8 teaspoon. So I'm going to fill this up. And now that's about halfway filled up. So I'm going to pour it into my custard cup. So when it comes to measuring your butter, if you have a stick of butter, you'll notice on the one side that there's something here that looks like a ruler, and that is your measurement guide for a cup, 1/2 cup, 1/4 cup, tablespoons, and teaspoons of butter. Now, one stick of butter is only a 1/2 cup, okay? So if you need a 1/4 cup, then you would cut that in half for a 1/4 cup. However, for this recipe, it's only asking for a tablespoon and a 1/2 of butter. So what you do is you look at that little ruler here on the side, and we have teaspoons on the top and tablespoons on the bottom. And so I'm going to go by the guide on the bottom because I need my measurement in tablespoons. And so I'm going to find a tablespoon and a half, which is about right there, and then I'm going to use a knife to cut that. So with that being said, I ensure that I have my tablespoon and a half, and I'm going to cut that. Notice how I'm cutting it on a cutting board, yes. And there is my tablespoon and a half. And obviously you're going to need to unwrap it afterwards because you do not want to eat that wax paper. So now we're going to measure the oil. For this we need a tablespoon and a teaspoon. So take my oil and I'm going to carefully measure, carefully, pour it into a little custard cup or ramekin. Okay, and now I need a teaspoon. So I'm going to do the same. Pour it in. And there's my oil. When measuring milk, you want to use a liquid measuring cup because it's clear and it has lines on the side to tell you what your measurements are. Okay, so what you're going to do is you're going to pour, and I'm looking for a 1/3 cup of milk. So the line is right there. I'm going to check it at eye level is to ensure that it is a true measurement and that it really does line up, because in this case the meniscus, or the middle part of the liquid, the lowest part, needs to line up with that line according to the measurement that you want. In this case, it's a 1/3 of a cup. So now that I measured all of my dry ingredients, I'm going to pour them into my mixing bowl. So that would be my flour, and now I'm going to mix it with a whisk. And the reason why is because that whisk is going to really break up those individual ingredients and ensure that they all mix together. So now for the next step, after mixing the dry ingredients, I'm going to take that oil and I am going to pour it in, okay? And now for this next method, I'm going to show you how to cut in, okay? So cutting in means mixing fat with dry ingredients. And so typically you can use a pastry blender, but I do not have one at home, and I'm certain that most of you don't have one at home either. So in this case, I'm going to show you how to do it with a fork. You can also use 2 forks. So I'm going to mix it up, and you also want to break it up as best as you can. So if you have larger chunks, and you want them to be smaller chunks, because again, we want to make crumbs. That's the ultimate goal, is making crumbs. So you can go like this, or use the 2 fork method, and you can really just break it up. You can do that to create smaller chunks, especially if they are caught in your fork. You can use your other fork to break it up. And there you go. There are your crumbs. See? Very crumbly. Now we are going to slowly pour in that milk, and again, grab that fork, because you are going to be stirring it up. So again, it was only a 1/3 cup of milk, okay? And use your fork to lightly mix it. You want your batter to not be smooth, you want it to be chunky, because you just did all that work to create those crumbs, and you want to keep those crumbs. You see, those crumbs are what's going to give you that nice pastry, flaky type of texture in your biscuits. And that's truly what makes a biscuit a biscuit. In fact, cutting in the fat is known as the, drum roll please, biscuit method. Yes. So that's a very important step. So now my chunky batter with the cheese that was already in there before we put the milk in, that is all mixed up now. So now I'm going to scoop out my batter using a spoon. I'm going to put it onto my baking sheet here. You want your baking sheet either lined with parchment paper, or if you don't have parchment paper, you can use foil like I did. Okay. I'm using the spoon to shape it a bit. So now that I have my 4 pieces of biscuit dough onto my baking sheet, I'm going to put it into the oven. So I'm going to put on my oven mitts so that I don't burn myself. I'm going to stand to the side as I open the oven. I'm going to pull out the top rack, which happens to be centered in my oven. And I'm going to, with 2 hands, put my baking sheet onto the rack, push it in, close the door, and now I'm going to bake it for 9 to 10 minutes, which means that I'm going to set my timer for 9 minutes. Right there, 9 minutes. I'm going to hit start, and now it will start going. Every oven is different, however, so make sure that you set the timer according to your oven. Now that the biscuits are baking, we are going to work on the topping. So we're going to use a 1.5 tablespoons of butter, a 1/4 teaspoon of garlic powder, and a 1/4 teaspoon, a heaping 1/4 teaspoon, which means you don't need to level it off afterwards, of Old Bay seasoning, and a 1/4 teaspoon of parsley flakes, or if you want an extra kick, you can use Italian seasoning. What we're going to do is we are going to melt the butter in the microwave. Now, be mindful, you only want to start at 20 seconds, and then if it's not melted enough, go in 5-second intervals from there. But you never want to burn your butter in the microwave, because once you burn the butter, it has an awful taste and there's just no going back after that. So now that my butter is melted, I'm going to add the 1/4 teaspoon of garlic powder and the heaping 1/4 teaspoon of Old Bay seasoning. And I'm going to take that fork that I used earlier, I'm going to mix it up. So now my timer's going off and it's saying that my muffins or my biscuits have baked for 9 minutes. So we're going to open this up, standing to the side. Going to pull out the rack. And look at that, they are nicely browned on top, yes. All right, which means that I don't need to bake it for an extra minute. So when a recipe says that you need to bake it for 9 to 10 minutes, that means that you, turn off that timer, that you start it at the first time frame that they give you, and then you can add a minute to that if needed, but I don't need it because these are nicely golden brown, as you can see. So now I'm going to take that butter mixture and I am going to use a pastry brush, or in this case a basting brush, and I'm going to make sure it's all nicely mixed, and I'm going to brush it onto the biscuits, and then I'm going to sprinkle on some Italian seasoning on top. You want to do it immediately after brushing on the butter so that the parsley flakes, or in this case the Italian seasoning, can really stick to the biscuit before the butter totally solidifies as it is cooling down. So go ahead and do that for all 4 of them. So now the biscuits are done. They've baked. They have their buttery spread on them, along with the Italian seasoning or parsley sprinkled on top.